So what's inside of the Angular JSON file? This is a file which is generated automatically when you generate a new Angular project. And this is used by the CLI behind the scenes to run different CLI commands and to know how to run these commands. Basically here, you can set some defaults for all these flags you could otherwise add manually to every command. And of course, setting defaults is more appropriate because it saves you the hassle of having to add all these flags all the time. So what do we have in there? Now this Angular JSON file uses, well, the JSON data format to, well, store its information. And there it follows a certain schema, which is developed by the Angular team. And it's stored in this folder, not something we should change, just some information. The version here, you can leave this the way it is. This is just the version of this file format here, basically. Interesting is the new project root entry here. This controls where new projects in your project here, in the end, are added. This might not tell you much. What are projects? We'll come back to that. It turns out that you can manage more than one project in an Angular project folder. And thus far, throughout the entire course, we always had just one project, one app. Well, you can manage more, and I will show you how later in the course. For now, let's go with that one project. So next we have this project's entry, and there you have one nested entry per project. Now, as I mentioned, we have one project here, and therefore if I make this smaller, we see there only is one entry. And that also, as you see, is the default project against which our CLI commands will run. If you add multiple projects, again, something I will show you later, then you could specify here which project the CLI commands like ngGenerate and so on will run against. But here we only have one, so let's expand this again. Now we see which project type this is, and here it's an application. Now you have multiple types here. You have application and library. And by the way, you get auto-completion here, either automatically or by hitting Control Space. The default is application, which is a regular Angular web application, but you could change this to library, and I will show you what a library is later in this module. For now, let's leave it at application. Then we get the schematics here. Schematics doesn't tell us much, but schematics actually is a really cool feature of the Angular ecosystem, you could say. I will come back to what schematics are. For now, let's ignore it. Root basically tells the Angular CLI what the root folder of this project is, and here it's the, well, folder here itself, so the entire folder, and then where our source files live in. And you could change this if you wanna store your code in a different folder than source, but I'll of course leave it at source, but you can change this. Here you set the default prefix, which is added in front of every component. So if you don't want to use app, you can use a different one here. And then you get this architect command here, this architect area, which is the rest of our project-specific settings. Now here, the different commands you can execute can be configured. For example, the build command. There you see which tool gets used under the hood. And this is a tool which is part of the Angular DevKit package, which is one of the third-party dependencies we have added. And this basically is just the tool, the configuration, the code, which knows how to build an Angular project. So which steps to execute and so on. And this tool can be configured with options. These are options you also, at least partly, can set with these extra configuration flags on CLI commands. So on ng build --aot, for example, controls that this should be built with ahead of time compilation. And by default, this is true, so you would only need to set this if you want to set it to false. But you can set this with a flag, or if you know this should always be the case, here, for example, with that AOT option. There you see the default is true, but if I set this to false, now all builds would be done with the AOT compilation turned off. We see where the project should be output into, and here we see that is the dist folder and then the Angular config subfolder. We see what our root entry file is, and you could change this, of course. What the root entry file for the Angular application is, and you could change this as well. Where the polyfills are managed, you can change this as well. You can change everything here. And what your project-specific configuration file, tsconfig configuration file is. Assets allows you to configure which files or folders should be copied over in the output. In the source folder, we have an assets folder, and there I have nothing in there. But if I would store, let's say, an image in there, which I always want to be able to use in my application, I could store it here, reference it from inside my components, for example, by rendering an image tag there, and it would be copied over into the dist folder so that it is available in the served app as well. The styles node is one we used throughout this course project to include Bootstrap. Here you can set up which CSS files, either your own ones or third-party package files, should be included in the application by default. Of course, every component has its own style file, as you learned, but if you have some global application-wide styles, you would add them here, and these style files are also then used and evaluated by the build workflow, and in the end, optimized and copied over. For example, here you find the copied over style CSS file, which is empty for this default project, but where you could add your default styles. Here is the file where you would add your styles. So that is something. And if you have some scripts, some JavaScript files which should be copied over, you could specify them as well. Now you might not need this very often because you will write most of your logic inside of your Angular files, of your Angular components and so on. But if you would be using a third-party package like, let's say, Google Maps or Lodash or anything like this, where you maybe downloaded an already optimized script file, well, then you can just specify it here and it will be copied over and included in your application. Now, a side note already, more about all these configuration options, of course, can again be learned in the official docs. There, under Workspace Configuration, you learn about all these settings in great detail and what you can set there and why and in which different ways you can configure things here. So in addition to watching this lecture, this is a resource you also might want to check out to learn everything about what you could possibly do here. Now, besides the options for the command, you also find configurations. This might sound like it's the same, but the difference is that options basically are default options which are always applied. With configurations, you can configure different environments for your options. So you could say, I want to have some steps or some options which are only taken into account if I build for production, for example, or if I build for development. So here we got some production-specific settings. For example, that a file should be replaced. This is in the environments folder. And in the end, this simply tells the CLI that it should swap the environment TS file for the environment.prod TS file when it builds for production. This allows you to specify different environment variables in the end for the different productions you're building for. So let's say you're using Google Maps and you have a Google API key, and you have one key for development and one key which is more locked down and restricted for production. Then you would store the development key in the environment TS file and the production key in the environment.prod TS file. And thanks to this setting here, once you build for production, which you do with ng-build --prod, this configuration will be used and the files will be swapped so that for your production code, your production key will be used. A little side note, --prod is just a shortcut to target production. The long form is --configuration equals production. Now, for production, this doesn't make much sense because you have the shortcut, but you can add your own configurations here, like a staging configuration. You can add it and override your own options here if you want to. Whoops, staging. So now here, I could set my own options, like AOT to false if I'm building for staging, and I could target this custom option with configuration staging now. So you can add your own configurations there, besides the default ones which are included. And as you just saw here with the AOT example, you can override any default options configured up there. So these defaults are always used unless they're overwritten down there. And here you see for production, there are quite some overrides or some extra settings. For example, here we have the maximum amount of optimizations and so on. And you can, of course, fine-tune and tweak this all to your personal likings. You can add more environments as you learned, and you can configure which options are adjusted in which way for which environment. So really, really powerful. Now, this is all still for the build command, right? Now, let's close this and move on to the serve command. Now there you see options is much shorter because here we have one main option where we basically tell the CLI that for this serve option, we want to use the build option. So all these options should be used for serve as well. And then we also have this production specific configuration if we would run ng-serve -- prod. Now, in case you're wondering how you should ever know which options exist, for one, as I mentioned, you get auto completion here. If you add new empty quotes, you see which settings you can set there. And in addition, the official docs I mentioned guide you through that, and you can learn more about the different options there. Now, then we got an option for internationalization, which I'll ignore here. We got the test options for running your tests and how your code should be compiled and used there. We can configure linting, end-to-end testing, and then we're done. And this is the Angular JSON file. It can look intimidating, but as always, the defaults are fine for most use cases. And if you need to tweak something, you got auto-completion. You can check out the official docs to learn more about that. Now, I want to come back to something I mentioned earlier, schematics, because it turns out that schematics, this term, is super important and helps us build amazing applications. What are Angular CLI schematics? Schematics are a powerful tool or a concept introduced by the Angular team, or specifically by the Angular CLI team. Schematics are basically blueprints which certain Angular commands can pick up. And for example, you can have schematics for ng-generate to generate new building blocks in your app, like components, for ng-add, which we hadn't had a closer look at yet, for adding, for example, libraries or certain capabilities to a project, and ng-update for keeping your project up to date. You can build your own schematics. Angular has some built-in schematics, which you have unlocked by default in the Angular CLI, and third-party packages can also add schematics, and that's what makes this feature powerful. Now, adding your own schematics, of course, is super powerful because you could build your own blueprints, your own ng-generate command for generating, let's say, a specific version of a component, which you need all the time. But let me also say that building your own schematics is not trivial. If you search for Angular schematics, you will find an introduction on the official Angular blog and also something in the official documentation. And there you also have this offering schematics part where you learn how to build your own schematics. It is fairly introductory, but it might be a nice start. If you want to learn all about it, it will be a lot of trial and error though. And I can also recommend checking out some third-party application schematics because that's what I now want to focus on.